Most people believe financial empires are loud, visible, and impossible to miss. Yet, some of the most powerful dynasties in history operated so quietly that even their absence from textbooks feels intentional. And the uncomfortable truth is that entire regions of global finance were shaped not by the names everyone recognizes, but by families whose influence was so embedded in trade routes, credit systems, and imperial incentives that history eventually mistook their silence for irrelevance. And that silence is where this story begins, not with a dramatic rise, but with a question that has no easy answer. How does a dynasty become indispensable to empires and yet vanish from popular memory without collapsing, being conquered, or even truly failing? In the long centuries before modern banking logos and central banks, wealth did not announce itself through skyscrapers or public balance sheets. It moved through caravans, ports, marriage alliances, and trust networks. And in the vast stretch of land linking Europe to East Asia, from the Ottoman crossroads through Persia, India, and China, finance did not operate as a single system, but as overlapping webs of credit, reputation, and obligation. And within those webs emerged families whose function mirrored what the Rothschilds became in Europe, not because they copied them, but because the incentives of empire demanded it. And among these families were merchant banker dynasties rooted in the East, operating across generations, borders, religions, and political regimes, quietly solving the same problem every empire faces: how to move capital faster than armies, how to finance risk without formal institutions, and how to make trust portable in a world where law traveled slowly. To understand why such dynasties mattered, one must first understand that for most of history, money itself was not standardized. Coins varied in purity, paper promises depended on reputation, and the long-distance trade required advance credit months or years before goods arrived, meaning that power belonged not to those who owned gold, but to those who could mobilize belief in future payment. And belief is always psychological before it is numerical, which is why merchant families who could maintain credibility across generations became more valuable than fortresses. In Asia, particularly across the Indian Ocean and Silk Road networks, families developed sophisticated systems of bills of exchange, rotating credit associations, and kin-based enforcement mechanisms that substituted for courts. And these systems allowed them to finance rulers, supply wars, stabilize currencies, and absorb shocks without appearing to rule anything at all, which is precisely why later nationalist histories found them inconvenient to remember. One such archetype emerged in South and East Asia, where trading houses evolved into financial intermediaries linking local producers to imperial demand, collecting taxes for rulers, advancing funds to monarchs before revenues were collected, and managing currency conversions across regions where dozens of monetary standards coexisted. And like their European counterparts, these families understood a crucial lesson early: political power is temporary, but financial infrastructure outlives regimes, so loyalty was always to stability, not to flags. Over time, these dynasties became indispensable because empires expanded faster than their administrative capacity, and when states could not tax efficiently, they borrowed. When they could not transport silver safely, they outsourced logistics, and when they needed to project power without immediate cash, they relied on merchant bankers who could bridge the gap. And in return, these families received privileges, monopolies, and access, but rarely visibility, because visibility invited confiscation. This pattern repeated across regions, from Persian merchant houses financing Safavid rulers to Indian banking families underwriting Mughal campaigns to Chinese merchant clans managing salt monopolies and grain transport for imperial courts. And while their names differed, their function was remarkably consistent, acting as private stabilizers of public power, absorbing volatility so states could appear strong. And this role created a paradox. The more successful these dynasties were at preventing collapse, the less history noticed them, because stability leaves fewer dramatic ruins than failure. Psychological incentives played a central role in their endurance because these families understood that trust compounds slowly and collapses suddenly, so they designed their systems to prioritize continuity over maximum profit, spreading risk across cousins, regions, and industries, marrying strategically, training heirs from childhood, and embedding moral narratives around honor and obligation that functioned as internal enforcement mechanisms stronger than contracts. And in doing so, they created organizations that could survive shocks that destroyed less disciplined competitors. Yet this same conservatism made them vulnerable to a different force, modernity, because as colonial powers expanded into Asia, they brought centralized legal systems, modern banks, and public debt markets that gradually replaced private intermediaries. And while European narratives celebrated this transition as progress, it often relied heavily on the existing networks of Eastern dynasties to function in the first place, using their local knowledge, liquidity, and trust to extract resources more efficiently, and once extraction was complete, these intermediaries were recast not as architects of stability, but as relics of a pre-modern era. The irony is that many of these families adapted successfully, shifting into new sectors, investing in infrastructure, or partnering with colonial banks, but adaptation further diluted their distinct identity, making it harder for later historians to see them as coherent dynasties rather than scattered business interests. And history tends to remember what has a clear beginning and end, not what quietly transforms. Economic psychology explains why this forgetting was almost inevitable, because societies prefer narratives with villains and heroes, collapses and revolutions, and a family that prospers by preventing extremes offers little emotional satisfaction, and so their stories were flattened into footnotes or erased entirely, even though their influence persisted in the institutional DNA of modern economies. Consider how credit itself evolved in these regions, moving from personal trust to impersonal systems, yet retaining the logic pioneered by these dynasties: diversification, information asymmetry management, and intergenerational planning. And one can see that while the names faded, the methods survived, embedded in contemporary finance under different labels. There is also a deeper discomfort at play, because acknowledging these Eastern dynasties complicates the simplistic story that financial sophistication was a purely Western invention, and it challenges the idea that global capitalism spread unilaterally from Europe outward, when in reality it was co-produced through centuries of interaction, adaptation, and mutual dependence. And this discomfort influenced what was taught, archived, and celebrated. The tension escalates when one realizes that some of these families did not disappear at all, but deliberately withdrew from visibility as political environments became hostile, choosing anonymity over prominence. Because in times of nationalism, financial intermediaries are easily scapegoated, and survival often means stepping out of the spotlight. And so the absence of monuments or popular histories is not evidence of insignificance, but of strategic restraint. By the mid-20th century, wars, revolutions, and state-led economic models further obscured these lineages, as assets were nationalized, records destroyed, and new elites promoted narratives that centered industrialization and ideology over trade and finance. Yet beneath these shifts, the old patterns of capital allocation, risk management, and trust-based networks continued to influence outcomes, proving that systems outlast stories. What makes this realization unsettling is not that a forgotten dynasty existed, but that history itself is selective, shaped by power, ideology, and emotional appeal, and that our understanding of how wealth and influence operate is incomplete because it ignores those who worked best when unseen. In the end, the so-called Rothschilds of the East were not a single family, but a recurring role filled by different dynasties across time and place, each responding to the same structural incentives, each proving that the most durable power is exercised quietly, through systems rather than spectacles. And the disturbing thought that lingers is that even today, we may be surrounded by institutions and networks whose origins are invisible, whose influence is normalized, and whose absence from our narratives says less about their importance than about our need for simple stories in a world built by complexity.